Our honor to present one of the outstanding Torah scholars of our generation, the head of Machon Shiloh, which is devoted to the revitalization of Judaism as a vibrant and relevant force in the land of Israel. Rav David Bar Chaim has devoted decades towards expounding a Torah methodology which promotes truth, intellectual honesty, and returning to a Geula mode approach. We thank Rav Bar Chaim for coming to Ramat Beit Shemesh and to Mosdot Rav Aaron Soloveitchik. And we would also like to thank all of those who came from a distance to be here. We request that everybody please turn off your cell phones.
Shalom Aleichem. Our topic tonight is dealing with Gaza. Why are the rabbis silent? Let me begin by explaining why I'm not going to speak about certain things this evening. First of all, I'm not about to even attempt to cover this issue from an halachic perspective. When I say cover, I mean bring all the relevant sources and all the opinions and all the discussions, simply because that's not possible in the time available. I have here, for example, an article written on this subject by a certain rabbi, which is 42 pages long, full of footnotes, etc., etc. And that also is really just the skeleton of what one could write about this subject. So what can we discuss? What is it important that we understand? Or put another way, why did I define and word that topic for this shiur in that way? Why rabbis are silent? That is the more essential thing that we must understand. And we'll get to that presently. But I will nevertheless begin with a few brief comments regarding certain halachic aspects of this discussion. And then we'll move on to the somewhat more ideological, more philosophical ideas and issues which underpin this topic, this discussion. As we know in the Torah, we have a pasuk in the Torah which discusses calling to a city that we're about to make war with. The Torah says that you must first offer them peace. Likro l'shalom. And without going into the details, there are different discussions amongst the Posukim, amongst the Rishonim and the Achronim regarding when is this required. Is it required in all cases, in all forms of warfare, with all types of enemies, or only in certain cases? The point I want to refer to here is something that was written by a certain Rav Yitzchak Kaufman, who's quoted in this article that I have here before me, which I will refer to a number of times. This article that I'm referring to is recalled the topic of this article is Lehima b'shetach revui uchlusiya ezrachit, warfare in an area in which there is heavily populated by civilians, written by Rav Neria Gutel. He quotes in footnote number 14 a statement by this Rabbi Yitzchak Kaufman, who writes as follows: Ra'ui likro la'oyev l'shalom. We are required to offer peace to the enemy before we attack them. K'shehadavar lo alul lifgoa b'matkifim. As long as this will not endanger our forces that are doing the attacking, that are about to attack them. In which way could offering peace negatively impact our own forces? He says, for example, Kagon ikuva hatkafa. If by offering them peace and allowing them, shall we say, a few hours to respond, we are delaying our own attack, and that in the meantime they are able to do certain things which will end up costing us more lives of our own soldiers or civilians, etc. In those sorts of situations, he says, Rav Kaufman, that we are not required to offer peace or speak of peace. If it's going to cost us in terms of human life, Jewish lives, then we don't have to bother ourselves with this issue. The author of this article responds to this, Rav Neria Gutel, and says, he says there are two problems with this claim of Rav Kaufman. He says, first of all, seeing that according to at least some opinions, and note well what he says, according to some opinions, because it's not according to all opinions. As we said, Rashi and Rambam don't agree, for example, on this issue. But according to some opinions, the requirement, the hovah, to likro shalom, to offer peace to the enemy, is minat Torah. You can't come along with a svara, with an argument like that, which is not written in any source explicitly, stating that we are not required to do something which the Torah requires us to do because it may cost us, in terms of, it may cost us human Jewish lives. He goes on to say, Rav Gutel, responding to the Chidush, the statement of Rav Kaufman, I read it in Hebrew first, Gam beti'un shebitul ha-mitzvah na'aseh mehamat hashash pikuach nefesh lalohamecha en dai. The fact that you claim that we are going to nullify this mitzvah of being likro shalom, of offering peace to the enemy, this claim that you are not required to do so because it may result in pikuach nefesh, in other words, it will cause the loss of Jewish lives, that's not a sufficient argument, says Rav Neri Gutel. Why not? Sheken habitul gorera harav pikuach nefesh hafuch. Because by doing so, you are creating a situation of pikuach nefesh in the reverse, that is to say, for the other side, for our enemies. La'am hasheni, for the other nation, the other side in this conflict. Umay hazit. My hazit is a reference to the Talmudic adage that my hazit the damach sumak tefeh, which means why do you but that's not in this context, of course. The Talmud states in another context, one Chacham says to a certain individual, why do you think that your blood is redder than your neighbor's blood? There is referring to two Jews who have a certain dispute. It's nothing to do with warfare with another nation, with the enemies of the Jewish people. So the author of this article, Rav Neri Gutel, states that the fact that you believe that by not calling for peace, not offering peace to the enemy with whom you're about to go to war, the fact that you believe this will possibly save Jewish lives is not an argument, because it's equally likely that it will do the reverse, that for the other side, that is to say, by not offering them peace, they will not have the opportunity to say yes, and if they don't say yes, they don't accept our terms for peace, then we will go to war. If we go to war with them, some of them are likely to get killed. So therefore it's pikuach nefesh for the other side. And why is our blood redder than theirs? This, if you think about it, is an absolutely stunning statement. It implies, actually it states explicitly, that the lives of Jewish soldiers, or Jewish civilians, as we will discuss presently, are equal in weight to those of our non-Jewish enemies. How could that possibly be the rationale of the Torah? How could the Torah possibly work in such a way? How could the Torah dictate to us such a policy? This is a point that we will come back to later in this shiur. I just wanted to mention it at the outset to show clearly how the approach of many people, rabbis and in other cases academics of different types who have written about this subject, their approach is often based on a kind of moral impartiality, a kind of postmodernism, if you will, whereby the differences between the Jewish people and their enemies are not meaningful, not substantial. We're all equal, as it were, in the eyes of Hashem. The Jewish people have are not in any way preferred, do not have a special status. Their interests do not come first. And as we will discuss later, this is a very problematic thesis. Not to say that it simply contradicts the entire spirit of the Torah from beginning to end. Another halachic source, and this is the main halachic source that I wish to quote for the purpose of this shiur, is the well-known halakha, or well-known in some circles at least, when these issues are discussed, is Hatov shebagoyim harog b'sha'at milchama, which literally means the best of Gentiles is to be killed in time of war. Interestingly enough, in this very detailed and very well-written article that I have here before me by Rav Neri Gutel, whom I add is a very serious Talmid Chachamim, a very serious Torah scholar, he makes very short work of this particular point. He discusses many points and many arguments, pro and con, presenting different positions, but most of the energy and most of the focus is directed at other issues, which in fact, in my opinion, are totally irrelevant to this discussion, not germane at all. The central topic, the central halachic source, which should be the basis for this discussion, Hatov shebagoyim harog b'sha'at milchama, is very often glossed over by people who discuss this issue. So what is this source? Briefly, let us go over the basic sources, where this comes from and what is it speaking about. The source for this halakha, and as we will see presently, this is most certainly a halakha, is to be found in the Mechilatha. Is to be found in the Mechilatha in Masechta Vayehi B'Shalach, in Parashat B'Shalach, Parasha Aleph. There, the Torah tells us that Paro, when he saw that the Jews had fled Mitzrayim, and he decided to chase after them, it says that he took 600 of his choice chariots and began to pursue them. The Mechilatha asks the following question: Mishel mi hayu habemoth shayu to'anim hamerkavoth. Whose horses were these that were pulling these chariots? Im tomar mishel misrim hayu. If you claim they belong to the Egyptians, the citizens of Egypt, Halo ne'emar vayamoth kol mikne Mitzrayim. It says explicitly that all the behemoth of the Mitzrim, all the animals belonging to the Egyptians, died in an earlier plague. So there were no animals left. It does, by the way, state, as the Mechilta will presently mention, that there were a few described by the Torah as Hayareth Devar Hashem, those who were God-fearing, or who simply were scared, took their behemoth and brought them inside, so they would not be killed by the hail. The Mechilata continues, Ve'im tomar mishel Paro hayu, and if they belong to Paro, to the king, because the king, in order to pull his chariots, needed and always had on call a huge number of such war horses. It says in the Torah, Moshe says to Paro, all your animals in the field will be struck down. And if you claim they belong to the Jews and they left them behind, Moshe said to Paro, we will not leave any of our animals behind. So to whom do they belong? So the maskana, the conclusion of the Mechilata is, Ela shel mi hayu, shel hayareh et devar Hashem. Nimsenu lemedim, hamikne shenis hayareh devar Hashem, hem hayu takala liYisrael. From this we understand, says the Mechilata, that the animals that were taken inside and protected from the earlier plagues, from the hail, etc., by the Yareh Devar Hashem, by the God-fearing amongst the Egyptians, it was their animals that were taken, their horses that were taken to drive the chariots and to pursue the Jews. Mikan haya Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai omer. From here, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said, we learn, Tov shebagoyim harov, Tov shebanahashim rasos eth moho. From here we learn, says Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the best of non-Jews should be killed. As we explained, this is talking about B'sha'at Milchama, and that's how it appears in some other parallel sources. In Masechet Soferim, in Midrash Tanhuma, in many of the Rishonim who quoted, it's quoted, and this is without a doubt the correct version of the text. Hatov shebagrim harog b'sha'at milchama, and by way of explanation, Rabbi Shimon adds, Tov shebanahashim rosos et moho, the best of snakes, you should crush its head. In other words, there's a very profound meaning and added piece of information in that somewhat grisly mashal of crushing the head of a snake. When you see a snake coming towards you, unless you're an expert, and most of us are not, you don't know what kind of snake this is. You don't know if it's a venomous snake, if it's the kind of a snake that might attack a human being or not. The wise and correct thing to do, says Rabbi Shimon, and this everybody knows, is to kill it. You don't ask questions, and you don't go looking for your nearest book of reptilian life in Eretz Yisrael or what have you, and check out on which page it refers to this and compare the photograph and see if it's the right one. You don't have time for that. It might attack you, it might bite your child who's playing a few meters away. What do? You take a rock or whatever you can and you kill it. If you're interested, afterwards you can ask one of your neighbors who may know more about these things what kind of snake it was. In other words, it's not because you know that this snake is going to kill you or even attack you. It's not because you know this snake is lethal, it's because it might be. Because it might be, and clearly you are not required, and it's not the will of Hashem that you give up your life to this snake, because that's what snakes do, and therefore you shouldn't get in its way. You should flow with the flow of nature and allow things to take their course. You are supposed to protect yourself, to defend yourself, and therefore kill the snake, ask questions later, shoot first and ask all the questions later. This is precisely what Rabbi Shimon is telling us about fighting the enemy in time a time of war. The simple halakha, not referring to a time of war, not referring to non-Jews, is that if someone comes to kill me or to attack me, I have to defend myself. I have every right and in fact the obligation to defend myself. In Chazal's words, Hakam lehorgecha, hashkem lehorgo. Everyone's heard that many times before. He who rises up to kill you, in other words, that you know that's his intention, even if he hasn't quite got there yet, he's on his way to do it, he's planning to do it. Hashkem lehorgo, you get up earlier than him and beat him to the draw. In other words, neutralize the threat before it even becomes a real threat, before it's actualized. In order to understand that, we did not need the statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, I should say. It's interesting to note, by the way, in passing, that in all authentic Chazalic sources, Rabbi Shimon is called Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. It's only in the Zoharic literature that he's referred to as Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Interesting to note. So that's why I corrected myself. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is not telling us something which we already know, something which is stated many, many times in many different contexts. That hakam lahorgecha, hashkem lahorgo. That's obvious. And every person on this planet knows this to be true. You don't have to be Jewish to know that. You don't have to study the Talmud or read Rashi on the Pasuk where he tells you this to know that this is so. Every individual knows that if someone is out to kill you, you have every right and every obligation, in fact, to defend yourself, even at the cost of killing that person. Similar and very much related to the concept that we have in Halakha, which is also well known, the concept of Rodef. A Rodef is a person, again, not necessarily a non-Jew, it could easily be a Jew, who is coming to kill you. A classic example would be two Jews walking down the street, coming from different directions. One of them sees this person he doesn't like, pulls out a knife and starts running at him and saying, "I'm going to kill you." And it seems that he's serious. He's running at this person with a knife held high, "I'm going to kill you." That person is a Rodef. This is discussed in halachic sources in great detail. And the halakha is not only the person who is threatened by this rodef, in other words, the intended victim of this rodef is allowed to defend himself even at the cost of killing the rodef, if necessary. If he can wound him without killing him, he can stop him without killing him, that's preferable, but it's not required. Depending on the situation, one can do whatever has to be done. Not only is that intended victim permitted to do so, and in fact required to do so, any individual who happens to be on the street and witnesses this event as it's taking place and is able to prevent the rodef killing the nirdaf is required to do so. Again, even at the cost of the life of the rodef. This is simple, plain halakha. There is no doubt in the world that this is so. Every posek who's ever lived, who's ever written on the subject, writes this. And it's in the Shulchan Aruch. I'm not even going to quote it now, as I said, because we can't go into all the halachic sources. But this is Aleph Bet, Pashut. That too cannot be the aim, the purpose of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai in this statement of his in the Mechilatha, Tov shebaguim harog b'sha'at milchama. Because that's a din of Rodef. That's not a chidush of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. It's not related to this particular case. We know the din of Rodef from a number of sources. When the Gemara, for example, asks what is the source for din Rodef, it doesn't bring this drasha on the pasuk regarding the Mitzrim and their war horses, which they didn't have, and they had to find other horses, and Paro went and took the horses of these God-fearing Egyptians, etc. That's not the source. The source is other psukim in the Torah, which again we won't go into now. So we are left still with the question, what is Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai's chidush? What is he trying to tell us that we didn't know before? Furthermore, many Rishonim, beginning with the Tosafot, this can be found in Masechet Avodah Zarah Daf Kaf Waw, Amud Beth, and in the same sugya there and other places, in all the Rishonim, something like 16 Rishonim, as I recall, discuss this sugya. All of them, by the way, relate to it as an halachic issue, as a halachic statement. Tov shebagim harog b'shat milchama is considered by all the Rishonim, without exception, to be an halachic statement, not as certain apologetically inclined individuals have claimed and written, that this is to be seen as some kind of allegoric, agadic statement, and it has no halachic relevance, etc. That is not so. And I will go on to prove and demonstrate this point in a moment. So all the Rishonim ask another question, which is, we have another halakha on that same daf in Masechet Avodah Zarah, for example, mentioned in more than one place, but that's one of the places in the Talmud, Masechet Avodah Zarah Daf Kaf Waw Amud Bet, which states that when it comes to non-Jews, lo moridin wa lo ma'alin, which means what? As it is explained by the Ramban in the Chidushim to Masechet Makot Daf Teth, and as it is explained by other Rishonim, the assumption is, when it comes to a non-Jew whom we do not know, someone we haven't met or we don't know much about him, the assumption is that he does not live according to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. He doesn't keep the 7 Noahide laws. And therefore, essentially, this person is Hayav Mitha. He's guilty of a capital offense, whether it's this one or that one, whether it's stealing or adultery or murder or Avodah Zarah or what have you. Avodah Zarah, of course, was perhaps the most common, the most standard, the most ubiquitous Avirah, which you could also see with your own eyes, not one of those activities which people tend to do behind closed doors. It was a well-known fact, these people worship Avodah Zarah. So that already, according to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, makes that person liable for the punishment of mitha, of being put to death. However, you can't just put a person to death without bringing him before a court. So the Chachamim said, if a person, such a person, a non-Jew that you don't know much about, who therefore is very likely, the assumption is that he's guilty of at least of transgressing at least one of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, is in a situation where his life is in danger, and you can either save him or not save him. In other words, he's about to fall off the edge of a cliff or something. You can either, you're there and you're close enough, you can stop this happening, or you can allow it to happen. You're not allowed to go and actively, proactively cause his death, bring about his demise, until he's brought before a court. And the court will decide if he's guilty and how he should be punished. As with any offense, as for a Jew or a non-Jew, you bring him before a court, a Beit Din, and the matter will be looked into, and the decision will be given by the Beit Din. But now there's no Beit Din, and now his life is in danger. You're not supposed to save him from death, nor are you supposed to bring it about. Therefore, you take a neutral, disinterested attitude. En moidin ve'en ma'alin. You don't get involved. You don't save him, and you don't push him over the edge. That's the halacha, again, which is not disputed by any of the poskim. All the Rishonim therefore ask the following question: If it says in one source that non-Jews are not to be saved, not to be killed for the reasons that we explained, how can this statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai say Tov shebagim harog, the best of goyim should be killed? Therefore, the Tosafot explain that this statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is talking about a situation of war. That in a situation of warfare, a state of war exists between us and these people, this nation, this group, this ethnic group, this society that is amongst us or living in some proximity to us, and one of their number is now amongst us. In that situation, he's no longer considered just to be a non-Jew who probably transgresses one of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. Rather, he is to be considered an enemy, a danger, because he belongs to an enemy force and you don't know what he might do. As we explained before, just as you don't know what this snake might do. Snakes are dangerous, or some of them are, very dangerous, and you don't take chances. That is the rationale behind Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai's statement. This is explained again by all the Rishonim, almost without exception. This statement is brought by the Rambam in two places, Michot Avodah Zarah, Perek Yod, Halacha Aleph. There the Rambam writes that if a person sees a non-Jew whom you know or you can assume is a idol worshipper, worships Avodah Zarah, says the Rambam, לפיכך, אם ראה גוי עובד עבודה זרה עובד או טובע בנהר, לא יעלנו, you should not save him, etc., etc. מפני שאינו עושה עמנו מלחמה. Why not? Because he is not actively at war with us. He's not involved in warlike activities against us. This is quoted by the Rambam, as I said, in two places. This also appears, by the way, in the Shulchan Aruch in two places. For those who have claimed, and there are those who have claimed, that we have no halachic basis on which to decide the question, how should we relate to enemies, and how can we fight them when there are civilians involved as well. Well, such people should be aware that there is such a halacha, and it appears in the Shulchan Aruch in two places, in the Yoreh De'ah Siman Kof Nun Het, and in Hosher Mishpat Siman Tau Kaf He, where this halacha is brought and quoted by the Bet Yosef and the Shach and the Bach, etc. And yet, not a few individuals who have written about this subject have tried to avoid this issue and reaching the obvious conclusion from these issues, namely that when fighting the enemy, even if there are civilians involved, when I say civilians, I mean people who are not actively under arms at this moment, people who are not taking an active part in the fighting at this moment in time. The conclusion based on these sources should be that we fight the enemy, and we do not limit our military response and our necessity to vanquish our enemies because of the possibility, even the likelihood, that some of these people who are not actually shooting at us at this moment are likely to be killed. In order to avoid this conclusion, certain people, including the author of this article that I mentioned, that I have here, wishes to claim that we don't know exactly what is meant by Sha'at Milhama. We don't know what does that mean in a time of war. What is a time of war? Does it mean on the battlefield, when the person's actually firing at you? Does it mean when there's a lull in the fighting? Does it mean when there's a general state of war between us? For example, between ourselves and the Arabs in Gaza right now, for example. There is a state of war in existence between us. You don't have to take my word for it. You can ask them. They'll tell you that's the fact. And it's written in their founding documents, and they reiterate this all the time. So is this particular moment in time right now, when no missiles are raining down on us as they were just a week or so ago, is this a time of war or not to be considered a time of war? Asking these kinds of questions has allowed certain individuals to fudge this issue completely. It's also claimed, and this I heard in a lecture given by the same author of this article, Rav Neri Gutel, that when it comes to these kinds of questions, we have another problem. And that is that we haven't got what he calls a Masoret Psika. We haven't got a tradition of Psak Halacha on this issue. Before I even explain what he means by that, there's one more source I need to read. As I said, more than one explanation or attempt to explain this statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Tov shebagim harog b'shat milchama, has been offered. One statement, or one explanation, written by the author of Mikevet HaMishneh on the Mechilethah, speaks of the following. He explains that the Hidush, the statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, refers to the following situation, which is in fact precisely analogous to our situation, or roughly analogous to that which we just saw recently in Gaza, for example, where we are trying to fight people who are firing rockets at us, and they're firing from within a densely populated area full of civilians, or so-called civilians. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, why I say so-called. But even if they were really civilians who are truly not involved and have no interest in what's going on, they just want to be left alone, the author of the Perush Mikevet HaMishneh on the Mechilethah, also the Tzedal HaDerech in his Perush on Rashi al Torah, writes the same. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is saying as follows: when you are fighting those who are actually firing and waging war against you, and there are civilians who are in the same general area and therefore will get hurt, if you fire back, you nevertheless are supposed to fire back and wage and execute that war without care, without holding back your punches because of the fact that these civilians are there. In other words, just as we saw in the case of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, that supposedly well-intentioned non-Jews ended up somehow supporting the war effort of the Egyptians against the Jews and helped them to pursue the Jews, etc. And you never know how things exactly will work out and who will help whom and who will hide whom and who will provide some support or succor for your enemies. In the same way, you cannot hold back from fighting your enemies for such reasons. That Pirush is also, without a doubt, true, but it's not even the most correct, in my view, of all the Pirushim written on this topic. There is one more Pirush, which surprisingly is not often quoted. I don't know why this is, but it's there for all to see. The Knesset HaGedolah, which is a very famous halachic work written approximately 4.5 centuries ago, on Choshen Mishpat Siman Taf Kaf Hey, which, as I mentioned, is one of the places where the Shulchan Aruch writes about this very halakha. He writes as follows, and I quote, "Wahanachon, the correct explanation is as follows: Shebala hashm'enu, that this statement, this halakha of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, which is quoted as we said in the Shulchan Aruch, comes to tell us as follows: Sha'afilu shezeh hagoy eno oseh milchama. Even though this particular non-Jew in question is not involved, at least at the moment, as far as we know, in the war effort against us. Imzoth, nevertheless, kewan shekelal umatho oseh imanu milchama, because he belongs to that group, that nation, that ethnic group, that organization, that society that is at war with us. Im Yisrael achenu, with us or with our fellow Jews, moridim ulo ma'alin, we are to do away with him, because he presents a threat, a possible threat, and therefore we don't take chances. That terutz of the Knesset HaGedolah, I believe, is the most straightforward, the most correct, and perhaps also the most authoritative of the poskim who has written explicitly on this subject to define in very precise terms what this halakha comes to tell us. According to that perush, therefore, if we are at war with an enemy nation, any member of that enemy nation, whoever it may be, is considered a threat to us, because we don't know if that person is really sides with the aims of his nation or his group, his society. Maybe he just wants to live in peace, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he just wants to come here and work and get a job and support his family, and maybe he'd like to do that as well, but sometimes he'd also like to bring a bag with some explosives and leave it on the bus, and like in Tel Aviv, for example, and then go on to his work because he needs to support his family. He may want to kill two birds with one stone. We don't know, do we? And we're not talking about hypothetical things, we're talking about things that happen. Therefore, the halakha is, says the author of the Knesset HaGedolah, on Choshen Mishpat Siman Taf Kaf Hey, any person who belongs to those we are at war with at the present time is to be considered a threat. Again, this is common sense to most people. Not to a lot of Jews, I understand, but to most normal people, this is common sense. And a simple fact of history will suffice to explain what I mean. When America was at war with Japan in the Second World War, as we all know, they interred a very large number of Japanese Americans. Why did they do that? Because they believed, and it makes no difference right now whether they were correct in thinking so or incorrect. There were in fact many cases which proved that there was basis to this supposition. But it was assumed that there must be at least some of these people who support the Japanese war effort against America and will possibly act as fifth column agents, saboteurs. They will pass on intelligence information, etc., etc. They'll drive around, take photographs, send them to a friend, etc. It'll get to the Japanese. They'll know where to attack, what not to do, etc. This is a real concern for a nation that wants to actually win the war it's fighting, as opposed to losing it. The Americans decided they wanted to win and didn't want to take chances, so they interred them. It's also the same Americans, by the way, who, not wanting to lose the estimated 1 million American soldiers that would have been killed in a ground invasion of Japan. That was the estimate of the General Staff of the United States Army at the time, and wanting to bring about an earlier end to the war, which had been going on for many years already. They decided to drop 2 nuclear bombs on the Japanese just to make it clear to them that there's no point continuing. And that's what happened. It worked. Because guess what? Sometimes overwhelming force works. But that's only if you really want to win. We, at this point, apparently, don't really want to win because we don't really know why we're fighting, apparently, and we're not sure who the enemy is and what's wrong with them and why they're so bad. But the Americans, for example, didn't have these problems, these hang-ups, these complexes at the time. Neither did the British, by the way. The British carpet-bombed Germany for years. People like to talk about Dresden, which was flattened in one night, but you don't have to talk about that one case. They carpet-bombed Germany for years. Why? Because when you are up against a diabolical enemy and you intend to survive and win, that's what you do. That's what you must be willing to do, even though you'd much rather not have to do it. This is something, therefore, that many non-Jews understand without ever having heard of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, or Masechet Sofarim, or the Mechilata, or the Rambam, or the Shulchan Aruch. Our problem is that we have many rabbis who have heard of all those sources, read all those books, and don't seem to get it. And therefore, in the time that remains, I'll try and explain in as briefly as possible what the real problem here, I believe, is. As I mentioned earlier, some years ago, I was present at a certain rabbinical conference where the author of this article, Rav Neri Gutel, spoke. This was after he wrote this article, and he was asked certain questions about this issue which he spoke about. And he explained as follows. His position was as follows. He said, there are those who say that we can discuss this issue, this discussion of ours this evening, how we fight the enemy when it involves civilians or women, children, what have you. He said, there are those who say that we can find sources in the Tanakh which are analogous to our situation, which describe such situations, and then we see how our forefathers behaved throughout the Tanakh. There are a number of examples. One example is something we read every year that all of us know very well, Megillat Esther. If you read Megillat Esther, even not very carefully, you will discover that our forefathers, when given permission to fight their enemies, those who were planning to slaughter them, killed 75,811 exactly non-Jewish enemies. Because it talks about the numbers are given precisely, and to those numbers you have to add the 10 sons of Haman and Haman himself. That's 11. So the number is exactly 75,811. Quite a few enemies. And it also indicates, by the way, clearly in the Megillah, they did not limit their attack to fighting men. It speaks about Nashim V'Taf as well, women and children. This event is of course, commemorated and celebrated every year by all Jews. So Rav Gutel said we can't learn from the Tanakh because we cannot learn anything from the Tanakh, not halachically. We can't reach any halachic conclusion based on the Tanakh. I reject this approach. It doesn't actually say anywhere, by the way, explicitly anywhere, that we can't learn from the Tanakh. It's true that we see over time there was less and less reliance on Pesukim and understanding situations and analyzing halachic issues based on the Tanakh. That's true. But it's also equally true that when faced with a new situation which the Jewish people have not found themselves in for many centuries, in fact millennia, after all, for a long time we were in Galuth. We had no cause to delve into the halachot to do with fighting enemies and civilians and non-combatants, etc. These issues were not on the agenda. They were not on the Jewish agenda at all. Therefore, you do not find these issues discussed in great detail by the Poskim. There are sources, as we mentioned, real sources, but it's not gone into in the same detail, with the same fervor and energy that you, for instance, you will find on Hilchot Basar B'Halav, the questions of when meat and milk get mixed up. On that, much more has been written, because that's a real issue, so to speak, because everyone has a kitchen, and everyone has meat and milk, or most people, unless you're a vegetarian perhaps. But how to fight wars, how Jews fight wars, especially against enemies who deliberately want to kill your own civilians, that's not something that Jews in Poland or Morocco had to deal with 500 years ago. Second of all, he said, in this talk that I refer to, there are those who say that we have certain sources like the one I just mentioned here. It's interesting to note, by the way, that when he deals with this halakha, tov shebagim harog v'shat milchama, he quotes almost none of the sources that I refer to, particularly not the Perush of the Knesset Hagdolah on Shulchan Aruch, which is entirely unequivocal and unambiguous. He mentions only one or two sources and then reaches somehow, curiously, the conclusion that this halakha cannot be taken as any kind of halachic yardstick for our discussion, which is really hard to fathom, because it's precisely this halakha which is talking about Sha'at Milchama, and we are talking about Sha'at Milchama. Without defining now Sha'at Milchama in the most precise way and covering all possible situations, the situation we found ourselves in a week and 10 days ago and 2 weeks ago was most clearly, unequivocally, a Sha'at Milchama. When you have rockets and missiles raining down on you in many parts of the country, that has to be a Sha'at Milchama, because if it's not, well, I really don't know what is a Sha'at Milchama. The reason he said we can't go by certain sources such as this halakha that I mentioned, Tov shebagim harog b'sha'at milchama, he says is because we don't have a masoret shel pesika. We don't have a tradition of psak halakha on this issue. What does that mean? Again, it goes back to what I said before. If you want to look into the question of how rabbis in Poland or Russia were posek halakha on questions of basar b'halav in this situation or that situation, that's something you can easily discover by looking at the literature and looking at the shelot and teshuvot. You will find the answer. And if you want to know what Rabbanim in Teiman or Morocco were saying on the same subjects around the same time, that's also easily discovered, because there was a masoret, there was a tradition, because these things were discussed. And it's only because a certain opinion became the accepted opinion in a certain part of the Jewish world that we can actually express the view that this is the halakha. This is the mindset behind what he was explaining. In other words, we cannot know the halakha because we've studied the matter deeply and thought about it at great length, with great deliberation, and looked into all the relevant sources and looked at all the angles, and now we can reach a decision because there are people who are capable of doing this, whose job it is to do this. In other words, Talmidei Chachamim. We're not capable of doing that. We abdicate all such responsibility and we deny that we have such a capability. All that we're able to do is to say that a majority of the Poskim in our part of the world hold this view, and therefore this is what we do. Is it correct or not? Well, I don't know, but this is what we do. This is how we paskin. That is behind this policy, so to speak, this position of needing a masoret shel psika. This is not, by the way, an idea, a notion that I've seen written anywhere, explained anywhere. I've never seen it in any book or any article or any of the poskim talk about this. But this is one of the approaches that exists in the halachic world. And I'm willing to admit that it's probably has over time become the dominant approach in most Torah circles. That doesn't mean it's correct, and doesn't mean it's the only approach. But that is the approach that has become the common wisdom, certainly for many Rabbanim. And a person who is trained to think in those terms, that I'm telling you that on this question, the halakha is X, Y, Z. Why? Because that's what the Shach says, and all the Rabbanim that I've heard of, and all the Rabbanim in our part of the world for the last 400 years have been saying the halakha is like the Shach, therefore I'm telling you the halakha is like the Shach. Well, if you haven't got that kind of tradition, that kind of reality, those facts on the ground to rely on, you have to actually make your own decision. You have to think for yourself, and you have to reach a conclusion based on the sources and based on reason and based on intelligent argument and proper understanding. Then you've got a problem. Then the system breaks down. We'll take a break now for Arvith and then we'll continue. We were speaking about the breakdown of the system. What do I mean by that? As I've mentioned and explained on other occasions, we find a strange thing in the yeshiva world. When a young man gets to yeshiva, he's told that you must think and ask questions. Don't accept anything simply because you're told that's how it is. You have to understand why it is so. I know for a fact this is what I heard from my first Ram in the first yeshiva where I learned when I was 17 years old. And this continues for a number of years, assuming the boy continues to study in the yeshiva. And then at some point, maybe he got married, etc. Then he goes into a kollel track. The purpose of a kollel, depending, but often is to become a Rav. And he starts studying different subject matter altogether. And there, not only is the subject matter different, but the way it's learned is very different. Whereas before, he was learning the Gemara and the Rishonim and asking questions in order to understand the inner workings of the halachic system, or at least that's what would happen if a person was allowed to develop in that fashion correctly. Here, now the young man is told, you have to learn this source here, this source over here. He's in a well-organized kollel, at least. They present the individuals involved with a source sheet. It's all written out for you. Basically, you're being spoon-fed. Look at this source here, this source over there. The Bet Yosef here, the Shach and the Taz over there. And then the shiur, etc., given by the person in charge. You're told this is how we paskin. This is the halacha. You're not allowed to ask questions why this is the halacha, because if you happen to have learnt the subject in greater depth, you may be aware there are other shittot and other explanations which perhaps, based on what you've seen at least, make more sense, fit the sources better, and yield a much more reasonable halachic approach. We're not allowed to ask those questions. If you ask too many of those questions, you'll probably find yourself asking to leave. Being asked to leave, because you're rocking the boat. That's not the system. The system is, this is what we do. Why? Lama kacha. This is how it works. This goes back to what we spoke about before, what certain people speak about, such as this rabbi that I mentioned before, Rav Neri Gutel, in his talk on the subject when speaking about this topic of warfare and involving civilians. He said you need a masoret shel psika. You can't be posek from the Rishonim, straight from the time of the Rishonim, and jump to the present day. There has to be a chain of tradition of psak halacha on that particular topic. And if you haven't got that, well, basically you're up the creek without a paddle. You can't do very much. As it happens, that claim is not even true or relevant in our case, because I quoted sources starting from Chazal and ending with Achronim, who discuss this particular halacha of hatov shebogim harog b'shat milchama. And the sources clearly indicate which is the correct approach. And yet, as we said, it's not something that you'll find written about in the Mishnah Berurah. It's not something that community rabbis have been dealing with for generations. So all of a sudden this becomes some esoteric halacha that Jews don't really know how to handle. It's a hot potato. And therefore, we're stuck. But guess what? It's no longer an esoteric halacha. Now it's real world halacha. Now it's life and death halacha. And you have to have an answer. But if your halachic system is, as we just described it, this chain of tradition of masoret shel psika approach, where you do not reach conclusions, where even those who are qualified and able to do so do not reach conclusions based on their own thinking, their own reasoning, their own research, and are not willing to express those views and take responsibility for what they say or don't say. If you don't have that system, if you don't have that ability, you don't have that willingness or that drive, and you are simply relying on precedent and what people say, what people do, then you really have a problem. And that's exactly why Galuth mode Judaism has nothing to say when it comes to the topic that we're discussing tonight, how to deal with our enemies in Gaza, for example. Because in Galuth mode Judaism, there is no Gaza, and there are no enemies, at least not of that type. And if there are enemies, then you certainly haven't got an army, and there's no point discussing what you might do to them, because you can't do it. So why bother discuss it? Instead, you discuss Hilchot Kiddush Hashem, how to die properly when the Cossack comes to slit your throat because you refuse to kiss the cross. That's what a good Jew discusses before before you walk into the gas chamber. You sing Ani Ma'amin or something, and that's considered in some circles to be the pinnacle of Jewish heroism. There is much to be said about that, and there are many of our people who died in such situations, and when there in fact was nothing else to do. But that's thankfully not our situation today, and nor is that the ideal situation by any means. The ideal situation is to destroy the enemy. That should be the purpose of warfare. This has been written by all experts on the subject, from Sun Tzu, I believe his name is, a Chinese military historian and military strategist, and von Clausewitz, etc., etc. There's much literature and much has been said about this. The purpose of warfare is to win. That means to destroy the enemy so he won't get up. So if your halachic system works in that very limited and very unadventurous, unimaginative, and essentially frozen approach, whereby you can only know that which has already been discussed and that which is done, but dealing with new situations is beyond your ken, then you have a system which is broken down. And that's why many rabbis, at least, feel they have nothing to say about this subject. They don't feel that they have a Masoret Shel Psika they can refer to. This is not something they heard from their rabbis. It's not something they can look up in the Mishnah Brura. And therefore, if you have nothing to say, you remain silent. That's one answer to the question, why rabbis are silent. But there in fact is another explanation, which is not just equally true, but even, I think, more profoundly true. And that is the very strange and very anti-Torah position that somehow the lives of Jews, for the moment we won't even go into a distinction between soldiers and civilians on the Jewish side, the lives of Jews and the lives of the enemy are somehow equal in importance. If you recall, I quoted at the beginning of this shiur the question asked by one Rav in response to the suggestion of another Rav. Rav Gutel responding to Rav Kaufman. Rav Kaufman said, you don't have to sue for peace, you don't have to talk about these things with the enemy if you think it's going to result in more people on our side being harmed or killed. Rav Gutel responds and says, you can't claim that the fact that it's pikuach nefesh for us is a sufficient reason not to do this, because in fact what you're doing is causing pikuach nefesh. In other words, you're increasing the chance of people on their side being killed. Well, that's correct. Isn't that the whole point? The purpose of war is to win. The purpose of war is to destroy the enemy. If that's not the purpose of war, then why are you fighting the war? What is there to fight about? How can the lives of your side be less important than the lives of the other side? Even if, for example, you were to consider the lives of these two people on either side of the war in question to be somehow equal, somehow comparable, which is also a totally anti-Torah approach. Since when are Jews and non-Jews equal in that sense? Since when are the interests of the Jewish people no more important than the interests of other groups or other nations or other organizations? Just to quote one example, there's a famous halacha in the Talmud, which is quoted in all the poskim, that if a Jew and a non-Jew come before a court and they have a monetary dispute, dinei mamonoth, a Jewish court, then the court, if this court were to follow halakha, it would work out to the benefit of the non-Jew in this particular monetary dispute. But if they were to follow non-Jewish legal practices and concepts, it would work out to the benefit of the Jew. Then they tell the non-Jew, we will judge this case according to your laws, not according to our laws. And if it works out the other way, then they work according to the halachic system. In other words, clear preferential treatment is given to the Jew as opposed to the non-Jew. There's also the well-known fact that the Torah itself speaks about returning a lost object to one's brother, achicha, which refers to a fellow Jew. There is no requirement to return a lost object to a non-Jew. To people who were brought up and have accepted as obvious that all human beings are equal and all have equal rights and no one should be preferred in any way or discriminated against as compared to someone else, no matter what, then this is a very difficult halakha to accept. But the fact is the Torah is full of such halakhot, many, many halakhot. In fact, in that book that I quoted from earlier, I have a whole article quoting many, many such examples. But we can't go into that now. All I can tell you now that's relevant to our discussion is that Rav Kook, in a famous letter, the first volume of Igrot Raya, I think it's on page 119, he explains the rationale behind this halakha of not returning a lost object to a non-Jew. He says the Torah here is making a value judgment. The Torah is assuming that if this piece, this property, this money, this object is going to remain in the hands of the Jew who found it, taking the long view, looking at the big picture, it'll work out better for humanity and the world when this property is in the hand of that Jew than if it's in the hand of the non-Jew. He'll probably do something more positive with it than the non-Jew. You, of course, could claim that's only true in some cases, not true in all cases, but that's the assumption, that's the chazakah that the Torah is working with. That if it's money that's in dispute, the same is true for this example we mentioned about a Jew and a non-Jew coming to before a Beit Din and saying we have a monetary dispute. We use whatever system will be to the advantage of the Jew because we assume that it's better in general terms, looking at what's better for humankind in general, that this money which is in dispute it will be in the hands of the Jew rather than the hands of the non-Jew. That's not in any way that does not imply that it is mutar to steal from a non-Jew. But here we're not a question of stealing. It's not a question of breaking into someone's home at night and stealing some money from his purse. We're talking about something which left his reshut, it fell out of his pocket on the street, and he walked off, he didn't know about it. In terms of whose property is it, that's really unclear. Who claims it? Who says it belongs to him now? He doesn't even know he lost it. It's not his. It's no longer his. It's on the street. It's for all to take. The Torah is mahmir and says if it belongs to your fellow Jew, your brother, then you have to try and return it to him. But that's a hidush. That's already going beyond the call of duty. But with regard to a non-Jew, that's not required. So says Rav Kook. So the problem is the assumption of moral equivalence, that all people, all societies, all religions, all cultures, all civilizations are equal. You cannot make a value judgment as to one being better or preferable to the other. That is the mantra in the Western world, has been for a long time. It's not always true that everyone who even states or chants the mantra actually believes it, but that's what you're supposed to believe. That's PC. But that's not the Jewish position. The Jewish position is that the interests of the Jewish people, for example, even when it comes to the Jewish individual, it's even more so. It's kal v'chomer when it comes to the Jewish nation. But even in the case of the Jewish individual as opposed to a non-Jewish individual, when we can alter the result by showing some preference to the Jew as opposed to the non-Jew, we do so. How much more so when we're talking about the benefit, the welfare, the survival of the Jewish people? The idea, the notion that we should endanger our own people, our own soldiers or our own civilians, because we don't wish to endanger someone else's civilians, is outrageous, even from a totally non-Torah perspective. It is the responsibility and the duty of any government in any country to protect its own citizens first, to put them first, to put them ahead of everybody else. And that's how all governments, all nations normally behave. It reminds me of the well-known quote, a statement made by Robert Frost, who said, "A liberal is a man too broad-minded to take his own side in a quarrel." Here we have a position, a philosophical and unfortunately in some cases an halachic position or a quasi-halachic position, which is so broad-minded and so liberal and so concerned with human life that it puts the human life of others, other people, other nations, no matter how evil and diabolical they might be, ahead of our own. It goes without saying that in the real world, when it comes down to total war and threatened annihilation with a truly evil enemy, such as the Allies fighting the Axis powers, the Germans, or what have you, the Japanese, in the Second World War, it goes without saying that all these theories are left by the wayside, and war is conducted without any care, without any concern for such issues. But in theory, at least, this is what goes on. Some people like to claim that's what international law states. Well, this morning I had a conversation with a person who's knowledgeable when it comes to matters of international law. Attorney Howard Grief, his name is, who wrote a book some years, which was published a few years ago, called The Legal Foundation of I'll give you the name just a second. I'm quoting it, I will quote it correctly. The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel under International Law. Howard Grief. Look it up on Amazon if you wish. I recommend it. A very, very interesting, very important book. Although he admitted this particular area of warfare and civilians, etc., is not his field of expertise, but he said, in his opinion, we are certainly, even according to international law, we're at liberty to fire and attack those areas where war is being waged, from where war is being waged against us, without concern for civilians that may be hurt in the process. I would say further that any system of law, international or otherwise, which in theory, according to the claims of some at least, makes such behavior in order to defend oneself from those trying to kill you and your civilian population, any such system which makes that kind of response illegal or improper is itself the most improper, the most immoral of systems. The idea that innocence on one side should be sacrificed, or even soldiers on one side should be sacrificed because of the possibility of the other side suffering casualties, particularly when we are not being neutral about it, that itself is an extremely immoral position, because we do not accept, or we certainly should not accept, we should not believe that we're talking about two sides, each with a grudge and an axe to grind, and each has some problem with the other side, and therefore we're talking about it's like two children in the street having a little bit of a squabble and hitting each other. And all we need to do is separate them and everything will calm down. That's not what it's all about. As we know, we're talking here about a diabolical, evil empire, to quote Ronald Reagan when he referred in the 80s to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. What we're facing today, the Islamic world, and we see what's going on around us as we speak, the way fundamentalist Islam, which is bent on one thing, and that is to dominate humanity, dominate the world, but first of all, kill all the Jews, drive them out of Eretz Israel, etc., etc. We know that we are facing an empire that is clearly more evil than the empire to which Ronald Reagan was referring to. So the notion that the Jewish people's interests can somehow be equated with those of our enemies, that is itself a crime against humanity, against the Jewish people, first of all, and in fact a crime against all of humanity, because the humane and civilized world should recognize who are the evildoers in this part of the world, and in the different wars and conflicts that are taking place. The civilized world should recognize the evil for what it is and side with those who fight the evil. And if they're incapable of doing that, it's because they suffer from this postmodernist moral relativism, and they cannot distinguish between good and bad, and therefore everything looks the same, because we don't really know what's right and what's wrong. Who knows? So everything's equal. Everything is equally wrong or equally right, and therefore you can't fight in the name of right when you don't know. You can't be sure that you're right. You can't be sure the other guy's wrong. Maybe he's right. That is exactly the quandary, that is the dilemma of the Christian world. This is a classic Christian European notion. It starts with the New Testament, where if your enemy strikes you on one cheek, you turn the other cheek. This is not a Jewish concept. It's a classic Christian concept. If that is at the basis of your culture, then going to war against the other side is a problem. Again, in the test of reality and of history, the non-Jewish world, including the Christian world, usually was able to overcome these reservations and these problems. But when it's not their own neck at risk, then that becomes the default mode. That becomes the fallback position. You shouldn't fight. It's better to be pacifist, or at least inflict minimal damage and protect lives at all costs, etc. Without looking into the moral and philosophical issues at stake. What is correct and what is not correct? What is true, what is moral, and what is untrue, what is immoral? What is evil and what is good? These are the essential questions that we need to ask ourselves, that any moral human being should ask himself. So our position when it comes to dealing with our enemies, whether they be in Gaza or elsewhere, has to be that we must be victorious. We must destroy our enemies because they are, first of all, because they're attacking us and they wish to exterminate us. And we don't have to speculate about their intentions, because they state their intentions clearly all the time, in writing. And they don't deny, they don't even try and hide it. They're proud of it. What the Jewish people would need to hear from its leaders and rabbis would be the following statement made by Sir Winston Churchill in 1940, in his first address as the newly appointed Prime Minister of Great Britain. He, of course, had for many years warned that war was coming, and this is what Nazi Germany would do. He, of course, was not listened to, because we don't want war, we like peace. So let's appease and let's pretend the problem will go away. We all know what happened. It didn't go away. And then when the problem became too acute, they turned to Winston Churchill and said, well, okay, you were right, now get us out of this mess, which he did. Without him, Britain would have been conquered almost certainly by Germany. In his first speech in Parliament as Prime Minister, he said as follows: "You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime." In other words, I interrupt his quote for a moment, his speech, just to emphasize this point. Winston Churchill was able to speak in these terms because he recognized that Germany at that point represented pure evil. And he probably didn't believe that his side was pure good in every respect and without fault and without blemish, but he knew that that side, those people are the bad guys in the most serious and most complete sense of the word. And we're not. We represent something better, and they are the aggressor, and they wish to bring great evil and calamity upon the world, and therefore we have no choice but to fight this crime. Therefore he speaks about a tyranny, a monstrous tyranny, and a never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. If you don't understand and accept and internalize that the other side are criminals in the most real sense, then you cannot wage war successfully. He continued to say, that is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer with one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. It is a great pity that there are very few Jews who are capable of making such a speech.
Is there a halacha that generally, as far as I understand...
The question was, when we mentioned this halakha earlier in the shiur, if a Jew comes across a non-Jew, and again the assumption of the halakha is, as we explained, that most non-Jews are guilty of transgressing at least one or more of Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. The halakha, as it appears in all the Posukim, based on explicit statements by Chazal, is that if they're in a situation of danger where you can either save them or actually dispatch them actively, you do neither. You do nothing. And you're saying that you have heard somewhere that you should do so if it will cause people to think better of Jews, etc. Well, it's not a halakha in the Talmud, it's not a halakha in the Rambam, it's not a halakha in the Shulchan Aruch, it's not in the Shach, it's not in the Taz, it's not in the Bach, it's not in the Mishnah Berurah, etc., etc., etc. I can tell you, for example, in Chos Shabbat, the Mishnah Berurah, the Hafetz Chaim, who lived in Tsarist Russia, not a particularly benign government towards the Jewish people, he writes that in a related halakha, or halakha that is somewhat related to our topic, to our discussion, which is that one is to Halel Shabbat in order to save the life of a Jew, but not the life of a non-Jew, because you don't consider all lives to be equal. For those who consider all lives to be equal, that's a very problematic statement. But in the Torah we have priorities, we have a hierarchy of values. And the Shabbat, the value of Shabbat, the erech of Shabbat, comes before the erech of the value of saving any human life. It has to be a particular kind of human life. In the words of Chazal, save him on this Shabbat, Mehalel Shabbat today, so he will be able to keep many Shabbatot in the future. In other words, a very subjective halakha. It's not an objective one. There's a human being whose life is in danger. That's true. But that's not the only thing that concerns us. It concerns us. It's not the only thing that concerns us. And it's not always at the top of our list. Again, that's not a humanistic approach. I never claimed that the Torah is humanist. Those who claim that it is tend to somehow dance around these halachot in whatever way they can. And that is exactly why we find what I'm telling you now. In the Mishnah Berurah, the Hafetz Chaim writes explicitly that I do not understand, he says, where these Jewish doctors nowadays that I see in my part of the world, in Russia, where they got the heter to go and travel and perform all kinds of medical procedures on Shabbat for non-Jews, which involve Hilul Shabbat. There's no heter to do such a thing. I don't understand who put this idea into their head that it's mutar. On the other hand, Rav Moshe Feinstein, living some decades later in the United States, a very different place, different society with different ideas and ideals, where the Jews, understandably, that doesn't make it correct, but understandably feel under pressure to conform, to fit in with those ideas, with those standards, with these ideas of equality, and we're all together, humanity's all one big happy family, which, to look around the world and listen to the news and you'll see it's not exactly so, but that's the theory. and the American melting pot, etc., which is also not really so much in vogue today as it was then. But at any rate, Rav Moshe Feinstein in the 1960s writes a tshuva to a Jewish doctor saying that he's allowed to perform all these actions and do these things on Shabbat. And his claim was, because if we don't do that for non-Jews on Shabbat, then they will refuse to treat Jews, because as a kind of revenge or something like that. Which, by the way, I think is simply unlikely. In other words, even if a certain doctor refused to do something and was reprimanded or even fired for behaving in that way, that doesn't at all prove that someone else would take some act or refuse to take some action or refuse to treat a Jew on Shabbat or in general because of that. It doesn't at all follow. It's very speculative. And in fact, the Chachamim were also aware of such a possibility. And nevertheless, they rejected this possibility. That's discussed in the Gemara Masechet Avodah Zarah, without going into the details. So we see that in different situations, different Rabbanim, even a great Rav, a great posek like Rav Moshe Feinstein, was influenced by the situation and felt that he had to say such a thing. But it doesn't become true. It's expedient, it's pragmatic, it's, some would argue, necessary, but it's not true. That is to say, it's certainly not the ideal. Even if you say it's mutar, it's not ideal. It's not what the Torah really preaches. And the same is true regarding your question. This idea that you should save the life of such a non-Jew because such and such will be the result. People will think more highly or less highly of Jews if you do this or do that. This is all very speculative. Who knows? For instance, you didn't do anything. They asked why. He says, well, I can't swim. The person was drowning. I can't swim, so I couldn't jump in. I would have drowned too. Maybe you're the champion swimmer, but you don't have to tell them that. Right? For example. In other words, there are many ways of getting out of that situation and not bringing any retribution upon yourself or other Jews. In other words, these arguments, which, as I say, are not well-founded halachic arguments in any authoritative halachic source, but rather responses in more recent times to a certain set of circumstances, to a certain reality in which Jews found themselves. This is not binding halakha. It's certainly not the essential, authentic message of the Torah. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, about the forces in Egypt belong to the bed.
I understand your question. For those who didn't hear, the question is regarding the halakha tov shebagim harog b'shat milchama, which the Mechilatha learns from the pasuk referring to Paro and his army taking 600 chariots and chasing after the Jews, etc. And the question was asked, where did the horses come from? And the Mechilatha says it must have come from the Hayareh Devar Hashem, from those who took their animals inside, so they wouldn't be killed in the hail, etc., etc. Your question is, well, who said that they gave them up willingly? They probably had no choice in the matter. Paro just appropriated their horses. Well, it's a good question. I agree with you entirely. I'm sure that Paro did appropriate horses when he wanted to. And by the way, I also think that if you ask me in actual fact, historically speaking, what were the facts on the ground, I don't think that the picture drawn by the Mechilatha is what happened at all. I don't think you have to think such a thing for one moment. I'm sure, first of all, you have to understand, you can't just take a horse or a donkey that's used to plowing in the field and attach it to a war chariot, which was, at that time, in those days, was like a tank today. It was one of the supreme weapons of war. If you had a well-trained force of chariots, which were drawn by special war horses, specially trained to how to behave in battle and not to be scared by battle, etc. They had to be trained for these things. The horses had to be trained, not just the soldiers manning the chariot. If you had a force like that, you were pretty much invincible. As we see in Sefer Yoshua, the Jews didn't have such weapons. So when they came across Goyim in Eretz Yisrael who had chariots, they came to Yoshua and they said, we can't fight these people. They have rechev barzel, they have chariots of iron, and we don't. The Jews weren't used to that kind of warfare at that time. The Egyptians were. The Egyptians were a world power. They were the greatest empire in this part of the world at that time, perhaps in the world altogether at that point in history. There's no question, and it's well known, the Egyptians were famous for their horses, well known, mentioned by Chazal, mentioned in the Torah, mentioned in the Tanakh. And there's no question that such horses had to be specially trained. So you can't just take a donkey or a horse who's used to ploughing in the mud next to the Nile River, attach it to a chariot and go off to war. That's like taking an engine from a regular family sedan, putting it in a tank and thinking it's going to work. It's not going to work. For a very simple reason. The car weighs less than a ton, and well, it's classified. So let's just say the exact weight of a Merkava 4 tank is classified information. I think I know what it is, but I won't say. But it's many tons of iron and steel. All right, you need a very big engine to move it. That's why it uses 4 liters of fuel per kilometer. Also, it doesn't work with a toy engine. You understand? In the same way, you can't take a regular horse, attach it to a chariot, and expect it to fight. It doesn't work. The idea, the notion that that's what happened, that's a fairy tale. That's not what happened. So what's being said in the Mechilata? The Mechilata is simply explaining, giving some background to the halakha of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai's halakha is based on one simple, straightforward thing. It's called common sense, A, and B, even more than that, it's based on the understanding that we come first. The Jewish people's interests come first, and our enemies come second, if they come anywhere at all. If they're not the kind that have to be destroyed because it's a mitzvah to destroy them, at very best they come off second best, not first. That's what it's based on. How you present that by way of taking these psukim and painting a certain picture, that's just the backdrop. That's not the play. The play is what the actors tell you. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is the actor. He's telling you, Tov shebagru im harog b'sha'at milchama. And he compares it to what? What we discussed earlier, the snake. Tov shebban hashim, he goes on to say, Rosos et moho, the best of snakes. That is to say, you're not sure. It could be a nice, calm, civilized snake, and the kind that doesn't bite, or the kind that if it does bite, it's not going to kill you. But you don't know. You don't take chances. You play safe. That's what the halakha is. That's this basis. That's the rationale. It's based on the interests, the welfare, and also, by the way, the concept of deterrence against the Jewish people's enemies. The best, as we all know, the best defense is an offense, and even better than that is to deter the enemy so they won't even think about attacking you, because they know if they do, they know what their end will be. And that's precisely why our enemies today are not scared of us.
Just one more point. The idea of enemies using the civilians as human shields. I understand that the people holding guns.
Okay, so for those who didn't hear, the question is, if we're talking about our enemies who are fighting us, who are armed and firing at us, etc., or planning to do so, if they are using civilians as human shields, we're allowed to fight them, even if those civilians will be injured or killed. But is that l'chatchila or b'di'avad? That's your question, correct? Is that the desirable outcome, or that is the inevitable outcome because we're in a situation of war and we have no choice? There, I would say it depends. On what? It depends on whether those civilians are truly innocent bystanders, so to speak, disinterested, unmotivated, not involved really in this conflict at all. They just happen to be there. It's like what? It's like a bank robber grabbing a hostage from inside the bank and running outside onto the street with this woman held in front of him so the police don't shoot him. Correct? She has nothing to do with the bank robbery. She doesn't want anything to do with it. But she was forced into the situation. So she's anus, correct? It's against her will. In the same way, if there's a civilian population that is being used against their will because they are scared, they can't fight these people terrorize them, they have the guns, they don't, etc. If they are forced into this situation, then, if possible, we should avoid killing these people, but not at the risk of losing the war, not at the risk of prolonging the war, not at the risk of risking harming even one hair on the head of one single Jewish soldier, or for that matter, allowing the other side to attack us or our civilian population, which is exactly what I saw recently. Someone sent me an email, a quote from the IDF spokesman's office, stating explicitly that on this time, on this day, in a certain place, we knew there was a missile launching pad and an apparatus, and we could have struck it, but because there were civilians around, we didn't do so. That's a moral position. In other words, you didn't want to attack those people, or attack that installation, because you didn't want to harm their civilians, and therefore a family in Ashkelon is going to have their house destroyed, their daughter killed, what have you, which is exactly what happened. There were people killed by such missiles, there were houses destroyed by such rockets, precisely for that reason, because we could have destroyed them, but we didn't want to, because their lives are somehow more important. So it's gone beyond the point of even claiming there's some equality. They're more equal than we are. It's like Animal Farm. All people are created equal, or animals are created equal, but some are more equal than others. So the other side is always somehow more equal than we are. Because we're, as Robert Frost said, we're the liberal who's too broad-minded to even take his own position, to even prefer his own argument, his own benefit, his own welfare. So if they're innocent bystanders, uninvolved, but they're forced into this situation, that's very tragic. Truly, it is very tragic. And it should hurt us if we are forced to kill such people. But the responsibility for the deaths of such people in that situation is on their heads, not on ours. They're the ones who took those people and used them as shields or as hostages, and therefore the onus is on them, not on us. If, however, the situation is quite different, namely, that the civilian population and the people involved in the fighting, the soldiers or the terrorists or according to some newspapers, gunmen, according to other newspapers, militants, activists, whatever the PC term may be, if the difference between those people, the civilians and the activists, is actually a very artificial and speculative difference. That is to say, in the case of Gaza, for example, we all know the reality. The reality is the vast, overwhelming majority of the Arabs in Gaza in 2006 voted for Hamas. We all know, as objective fact, and no serious person would deny this, that the overwhelming majority, when I say overwhelming majority, I mean 99.8% of the people in Gaza support Hamas. That is what they believe, that is what they think, that's what they say. And everything proves that that's the case. These people are Hamas, and the Hamas are these people, they're the same people. You're talking about civilians and fighters and soldiers. It's not that kind of situation at all. It's not like Dutch civilians caught up in the fighting between the American airborne and British airborne invasion in 1944, in September, where they tried to surprise the Germans in Holland and then enter Germany and end the war quickly by the end of the year, which they didn't succeed in doing. And they ended up fighting very bloody battles with the Germans in Holland. And then you had all kinds of Dutch civilians caught in the middle. They, even though most of them certainly were for the American and British invading forces more than the German occupying forces, nevertheless, they were not directly involved. They were caught up in the fighting. You certainly couldn't claim they were on the side of the Germans. That was certainly not the case. There was a Dutch underground, there was Dutch resistance, as is well known. All this is well documented. Here, this is the opposite. These people, whether they're firing or just happen to be there, they're all on the same side, and they all share the same ideology, which is an ideology of murder, destruction, extermination, and destroying the Jewish people, destroying the Torah, and bringing, as Winston Churchill said, a monstrous tyranny to the world. That is their aim, their express aim. Such civilians, so-called civilians, are not really civilians. That's why I said earlier, so-called civilians. because these people truly believe and identify with these goals and aims, and whatever they can do to support that war effort, they do. They give their own children. They send their own children to blow themselves up on buses to do this, as we all know. Those are not innocent civilians. That is a truly, maybe the word empire is too grand for such people, but it's an evil society. It's a civilization based on death worship, blood, destruction, and hatred. These are not innocent civilians. Such people are worthy of death simply because of the views they espouse and the actions that they take on a daily basis, which serve to support those actively firing and engaging in military activities against us. So in that situation, I would say it's lechatchila. And in that situation, carpet bomb the lot of them. That would be the correct response. You don't have to have any ground invasion of Gaza to solve the problem in Gaza. All you need to do is to line up a few hundred artillery pieces on the border with Gaza and give the order to start firing. For how long? A month, 2. Each artillery piece should be able to fire 500, 1,000 rounds per day. It's also, by the way, much cheaper than the missiles, precision instruments, I should say, armaments. Bomb them, destroy them so utterly and completely that they'll never dare to do anything to you again. That is what the British did, the Americans did, that's what the Russians did to the Germans, to the Japanese, because that was the correct response. That was entirely correct and moral. That is the only way to defeat evil. And that is the position of the Torah. And any other position is not only not practical and not efficient when it comes to winning and achieving victory, it is actually immoral. It supports evil in the world and allows it to continue. And there is nothing more immoral than that. We'll stop here. Question? Okay, you have a question?
Okay, so let's say that the government accepts that they have to cut the bomb, and no problem.
If we were to assume that's what they believe. All right.
Accept what we've discussed.
Okay.
That is the best course of action to take.
Question. Your claim is that the government of Israel adopts this policy not because it believes it to be correct and true, morally, philosophically, etc., but because pragmatically that's the only thing they can do. All right, well, first of all, I tell you outright, without equivocation, you're entirely wrong. In other words, the Israeli government does not think that. When Benjamin Netanyahu and Shimon Peres and a very long list of individuals representing the Israeli government and the Israeli establishment tell us time and time again, day in, day out, that we are so proud that our Air Force is so well trained and so skilled at bombing precisely that missile launcher over there without even scratching that Palestinian, so-called Palestinian, 50 yards away. And that's just wonderful, and we're so pleased that our pilots can do that, which they can, by the way, a lot of the time, and probably better than anybody else. That's also true. But they're not saying that because they don't believe it. They actually believe it completely. They have swallowed that Christian, European, relativist doctrine hook, line, and sinker. 100%. No question. And so have many Israelis. Not all Israelis, but many Israelis. Many Israelis are confused. I'm sorry?
What if that was their basis? If they actually did
All right, well, all right, so that's already a speculative question, that is to say a hypothetical question, because it's not the reality. The real impediment to waging war against their enemies is first and foremost the moral, philosophical argument that we've discussed here tonight. Is it correct to destroy our enemies and thus, first of all, defend ourselves, and second of all, guarantee that it won't happen, it won't continue, it won't happen again, to deter others from doing the same, trying to do the same to us, and fourthly, to destroy evil in the world? The reason that we can't do that is because too many of us, including most of the people who make these decisions, truly believe that false doctrine which they parade as the height of morality. which is in fact, as I've explained, the height of immorality, the height of confusion. What they lack, these people, what our leaders and many other individuals, Jews and non-Jews in the world lack, is moral clarity. There is no moral clarity. Everything is confused, everything is vague. It's like there's a big fog out there and you can't really tell who's who. There are people walking out there in the fog you can see, but you're not sure who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And you do not see that this is an evil society, a civilization, the fundamentalist Islamic civilization which is spreading across the world, and as we speak it is spreading and gaining strength throughout the Middle East and other parts of the world, as we all know, is an evil, death-worshipping civilization. Again, as Winston Churchill said, a monstrous tyranny. That is what they wish to bring upon us all. That is the reason that we behave as we behave, not because of the other arguments mentioned here, that if we do this, then the US or someone else will do that, or refuse to help us in this way, or refuse to vote in that way in the UN. Some of these considerations have some basis, in fact, and others do not. If we were to, in our own minds, if it were clear to us how we should behave, and we were to come out and say these things forcefully, clearly, without stammering, without sounding confused, without lacking self-confidence, if we were to stand up and say these things clearly, that this is the correct response to evil. If we were to remind those same Americans and Europeans of what they did when they were in a similar situation, how they behaved towards their enemies, if we were to make it our policy to say these things all the time, that would have a major impact as well. The fact that we are silent, the fact that we show and display, exude in fact, weakness and moral confusion and a lack of conviction in our own just cause, by constantly saying that we want peace with these people. Why on earth would you want peace with these people when these people are the epitome of evil? Why would you want to make peace with evil? Especially when you know that evil, even if it takes a rest, takes a break for a time, is only doing it in order to regroup, rearm itself, in order to try again, to continue. When we speak about wanting peace and with such people, when we speak about wishing to give land to such people, etc., we only encourage them. We only prove to the world that apparently the other side has a good case. And that is why we find ourselves in the present situation. That is why tomorrow in the UN there's going to be a vote which will no doubt proclaim that the PLO quasi-state achieves some form of recognition, because we have allowed it to develop in that way. Many, many years ago, even for those who believed, it's incredible that anyone could have believed such a thing, but even those who believed at the time that the Oslo Accords were a good idea, or were worth giving a chance, which is an inane thing to say, because giving it a chance is like saying, I'm willing to risk all my worldly possessions on one turn of the roulette wheel, and we'll see what happens. Either I win a lot, or I lose everything. You don't run a country that way, with taking such chances. That's a totally irresponsible and criminal act. But even whatever the excuse or the reason, the rationale was, those who said this is what we should do, this is a good idea, let's try it. All right, well, we did try it. And we know the results. And there was an agreement which was abrogated time and again by the other side. So why has Israel, for example, not got up? Why has it not been said years and years ago, let alone today or tomorrow in the UN or what have you, in response to what goes on tomorrow? Why don't we announce that this treaty is null and void? Because the other side has done something which, by the way, one of the things not allowed to do is to do exactly what they're doing tomorrow in the UN, explicitly stated in the treaty that no side may take any unilateral action, etc., etc. We don't do these things. This only strengthens our enemies. If we had a clear policy and a clear aim and are willing to show respect towards ourselves, to show that we have self-respect, and the world would respect us and take us into account more. When you have no self-respect, you cannot expect anybody else will respect you. There may be truth in that as well. I can't really, I can't do the mathematics and tell you which is a cheaper option. I don't know. Some people have said, for example, the Iron Dome is a terrible idea because each missile that we fire to shoot down a missile costs $50,000. Well, that's true. But the damage caused by one missile is probably that much or more. Okay, but it's difficult to make these equations. It's difficult to know. But that's not the point. The real point is that we need to fight and destroy our enemies. A, because they wish to destroy us, that's just common sense. You don't need the Torah for that. And B, because we are the morally good and they are the morally evil. You don't need any other reasons beyond that. If you don't have those convictions, then essentially you are leaving yourself defenseless and unable to deal with evil. And that's exactly what we see in the world today, that evil flourishes, and those who even perhaps really want to do something about it, because of all this confusion, this moral relativistic confusion, cannot do anything. And that is why, at this point in time, Islam is winning. Not a very encouraging analysis of reality, but it has one advantage. As someone said to me recently, this person said to me, "Rabbi, what you say is not PC, but it's AC." I said, "What's AC?" He said, "Absolutely correct."